You are listening to Book Clips, a podcast where authors and narrators expose you to excerpts from different books. You can find the show and more by searching for The Lesbian Talk Show on iTunes, Podbean, or Stitcher.
My name is Jeannie Levig, and this reading is from my novel Threads of the Heart, which I was honored to receive a Goldie for. And Jamie Patterson will be reading the first chapter for you.
Chapter 1, 1995. Maggie Rae-McInnis came through the kitchen doorway just in time to catch the full view of slender buttock clad in a pair of red jockeys for her. Dusty Gardner stood bent over, examining the contents of the refrigerator. As their longest-standing tenant and semi-exhibitionist, she had managed to make her cute little hiney a relatively familiar part of the decor, one that Maggie normally didn't mind stealing a glimpse of from time to time. This morning, however, Maggie wanted it hidden until the guest she was expecting had come and gone. "Dusty, love." "Hi, milady," Dusty answered with the lilt she sometimes used to mimic Maggie's Irish accent. "Would you please go upstairs and cover yourself? We're having company." Baxter, Maggie's 3-year-old Rottweiler, nudged her hand with the ball he carried in his mouth, and she absently scratched his ear. Dusty turned, a Tupperware container in one hand and a jar of mustard in the other. Her I-like Dyke t-shirt barely concealed her jockeys, and her favorite baseball cap sat backward on her head, taming the morning wildness of her collar-length blonde hair. "I'm covered." Her ocean blue eyes shone with mischief. "All that's showing are my legs." "Your legs aren't what I noticed when I entered the room." Maggie hoped her tone came off stern, in spite of her amusement. "Hey, I can't help it if you're obsessed with the more alluring parts of the female anatomy." Dusty padded on bare feet to the island in the center of the kitchen, and added what she held to a small collection of containers already on the counter. "Who's obsessed with the female anatomy?" Addison sauntered in through the dining room entrance, the morning paper tucked under her arm. The corners of her lips, those full lips Maggie could never get enough of, curved upward in a hint of a smirk. Her dark brown hair, still damp from her shower, curled softly at her nape in that way that always made Maggie want to play with it. "She is." Dusty waved the jar of mayonnaise in Maggie's direction. "No one is." Maggie blushed. Even after 12 years, she still sometimes felt like a tittering schoolgirl when Addison caught her by surprise. "I simply asked Dusty to go put something on." "What?" Addison pressed one hand to her heart and fanned herself with the other. "And cover up all the raw sex appeal that the bar babes go wild over? Come on, Dusty, give us the stance. Show Maggie how you entice those sweet things." Playfully, Dusty leaned an elbow against the white tile and lowered her lids to partially veil a smoldering gaze. With her free hand, she picked up the jar of Grey Poupon and held it in front of her. "This is a Corona, of course." Madison frowned. "Of course." Addison hissed and shuddered. How could any healthy libido resist that? "Well, Dottie," Maggie said, using the Irish endearment she saved for Addison alone, "if you're so stimulated by it all, maybe the two of you should see if you could get something going." She shot her a glance and raised an eyebrow. Addison took a moment and studied Dusty, seeming to weigh her options. "Nah," she said, dropping the newspaper onto the counter. "I prefer my women softer." She crossed the lightwood floor and slipped her arms around Maggie's waist. She nuzzled her neck. Maggie smiled and let her body mold into the curve of Addison's. "Ah, who do you think you're fooling? The biggest thing keeping the two of you apart is not being able to decide who'd lead." "I would," both women said in unison. Maggie chuckled. "I rest my case." She wiggled from Addison's grasp and ran her fingers through her hair, smoothing what Addison had mussed. "Don't think I was kidding about putting some clothes on, love. She'll be here any time." "Who'll be here?" Dusty took 2 slices of bread from the loaf and laid them side by side. "Eve Jacobs. She's the niece of my friend Carolyn. She'll be looking at Della's room." Maggie opened the dishwasher and began emptying it. Dusty snorted but remained focused on her sandwich. "Why would anyone want to look at Della's room?" "To rent it. Eve's going through a spot of trouble and needs a place to stay for a bit." "Della's renting out her room?" Maggie sighed. "No, I'm renting out the room. I own the house, remember? Addison and I. Della moved out last week." "Della moved?" Dusty looked up. "Nobody told me. She didn't even say goodbye." Maggie set the last glass in the cupboard and closed the cabinet door. "Darling, if you're going to be gallivanting with your girlfriends all week, you're going to be missing a few things here at home." "She could have left me a note or something." Dusty plopped a big spoonful of cold macaroni and cheese on top of ham slices, then reached for the peaches. She's always leaving me those damn little sticky notes about the toothpaste and stuff in the bathroom. She could have at least left me one that said goodbye." Maggie smiled. Dusty talked a tough game, but in reality she was as hard as a freshly baked muffin. "I'm sure she'll be back to visit. She's not moving to Kansas or anything." "Where did she go?" Dusty asked, still pouting. "She moved in with Nat." Addison sat down at the breakfast nook. "Nat?" Maggie nodded. "You know, Natalie, Nat," she said, turning from the silverware drawer to study Dusty's face for any sign of recognition. "The woman Della's been dating for the past 3 months?" She couldn't fathom how Dusty managed to even maneuver through traffic some days. She lived her life in such a state of oblivion. Sometimes, though, Maggie also suspected Dusty's lack of awareness was simply an act. "Oh, yeah, Nat," Dusty scoffed. "That's not a name. It's a bug." Maggie pursed her lips and returned her attention to her task. "And you wonder why Della didn't say goodbye to you." "Good morning, everyone." Tess Rossini, the other tenant who shared their home, strolled into the kitchen with characteristic grace, the softness of her voice a contrast to whatever turmoil Dusty was causing at any given moment. Her deep olive complexion glowed against the pale blue of a button-up shirt knotted at her waist and her white cotton shorts. She wore her sleek sable hair in a French braid that tucked under at the base of her neck. "Hey, Tess." Addison looked up from the paper. "Sleep good?" "Mm-hmm." Tess made her way to the coffee maker and retrieved a cup from the mug tree beside it. Dusty offered her a sly smile but said nothing, then slapped the top piece of bread onto the layer of peaches she had added to her creation. "That's disgusting." Addison glanced at the dripping sandwich before returning to the day's headlines. "Hey, it's a fully balanced meal all in one bite." Tess smiled and filled her cup with the spiced butter rum blend Maggie had brewed. Her eyes shimmered with the elusive peace that over the past year had little by little begun to replace the pain and fear that once haunted them. Maggie had suspected for some time that this gradual change had something to do with Dusty, but had chosen to mind her own affairs. She leaned against the counter and watched the 3 women dearest to her go about their activities. Tess added creamer to her coffee, while Dusty returned everything she had dragged out to its proper place in the refrigerator, something it had taken Maggie 2 years to get her to do. Addison sat peeling an orange from the fruit bowl on the table while she continued to peruse the newspaper. The scene seemed ordinary enough, but it was one that warmed Maggie's heart. The room for rent had come and gone to various individuals in diverse stages of transition over the years, but the 4 of them had remained constant for quite some time. Dusty had been with Maggie and Addison for 5 years, using their home as a haven in her otherwise wild and unsettled life. Tess had lived there for 3, ever since the loss of her partner in a car accident. They were a good mix. They were family. "So, Dusty, tell me about your latest conquest." Addison's voice brought Maggie back to the present. "I'm sure I have some catching up to do. I haven't talked to you in 2 days." Dusty laughed. "Oh, you're way behind." She plopped her sandwich onto a plate and strode to the table. "Wait till you hear about the looker I picked up the other night. She was almost more woman than I knew what to do with." "I seriously doubt that." "I said almost." Dusty grinned. "She loved my Harley, too. It was on the back and heartbeat." "Hold on." Maggie held up a hand. "Before you get all wrapped up in your escapades, you get upstairs and get dressed like I asked you to." She wagged a finger at Dusty to punctuate her order. Dusty winked. "Anything for you, Maggie May. I'll tell you all about it when I get back," she said to Addison before she trotted out of the room. Maggie listened to the heavy footsteps as Dusty took the stairs to the 2nd floor 2 at a time. "That girl." She shook her head. But her fondness for Dusty softened her. "She's 32, and do you think she'll ever settle down?" She filled 2 mugs with coffee and crossed the kitchen to set one in front of Addison. "Oh, someday I'm sure she'll find what she's looking for." "And what do you suppose that is?" "Someone just like you to melt her heart." Addison leaned back in her chair and grasped Maggie's hips. She gazed up at her, and Maggie saw the gold flecks in her green eyes reflecting the morning sunlight. "You think so, do you?" "Yeah, I do." Maggie leaned down and brushed a soft kiss across Addison's lips. "You do a pretty good job of melting the heart yourself, Dottie." The moment shattered with the thunder of Dusty's return trek down the stairs, and Maggie straightened. She turned to find Tess still at the counter watching them with an expression Maggie knew was a reminiscence of her own days gone by. Tess hadn't yet recovered from the loss of her partner and the life they had shared. To make matters even more difficult, her lover's disapproving parents had swooped in after the funeral and claimed everything in their daughter's name, including the house in which she and Tess had lived. Tess had been left with very little evidence of her past life and love. Although Maggie could sympathize, she didn't pretend to comprehend the true depth of the wound Tess had been left with. All Maggie could do was be there as her friend. Tess, would you like to join me on the patio for coffee? Spare yourself the details of Dusty's wanderings. That sounds nice. I have to return a phone call from last night, though. It'll only take a minute. Quick, save yourself, she added as Dusty bounded back into the room. I'll be out shortly. The only difference in Dusty's attire was the addition of a pair of minuscule cut-off jeans. Oh well, Maggie thought with resignation. All she had said was cover yourself. As she opened the sliding glass door and stepped out into the sunshine, Baxter close at her heels, she heard the eagerness in Addison's voice. Let's hear about your little date. She pulled the door close behind her, the barricade of glass muffling Dusty's answer. She wondered briefly about Addison's recent increased interest in their younger housemates' promiscuity and casual, at best, relationships. A twinge of something rippled through the back of her mind. Uneasiness? Suspicion? Addison had been in her mid-20s when they had gotten together, and had very little experience with other women. Coming to Maggie directly from her only other relationship, she had never had the opportunity to play the field. In addition, Maggie was 13 years older than Addison, and had always feared that as time passed, Addison might find her less attractive and want someone younger. She thought of herself in her 20s, of her first love, Julia, and how much Maggie had hurt her. Julia had been older and ready to settle down, but Maggie had been a bit wild and wanted adventure. Unlike Maggie at that age, though, Addison had seemed sure of what she wanted at the time. She and Maggie had made their commitment. And now that my age is showing? Don't be ridiculous. You're 49, not 149. Addison loves you. She's been with you for over a decade and has never once given you a reason to doubt her. She forced the matter from her musings and pulled a chair out from the rattan patio set. She settled into the cushioned seat at the table. Well, Baxter, lad, if Eve Jacobs decides to take the room, we're going to have less than a bit of time to ourselves today. We'd best get to enjoying it. The dog stared up at her and cocked his large black head as if to contemplate her words. She chuckled and stroked the underside of his chin. The peace she always found in her backyard enveloped her. She closed her eyes and raised her coffee mug to her lips. She remembered her astonishment 25 years earlier, the day she had first ventured up into the Hollywood Hills with her inheritance from her grandfather and her realtor and discovered this lushly hidden neighborhood surrounded by the urban chaos of Los Angeles County. At the time, the beauty of the house itself had seemed simply a perk of its gorgeous locale. Without hesitation, she had made it her home, and later their home, hers and Addison's. In the beginning, it hadn't been her intention to take in renters. That had simply evolved. A friend going through a breakup, needing a place to stay, a friend of a friend in town for a temporary job, and before she knew it, she had a house full. She learned quickly that she loved the energy of so much life around her. She listened to the melody of the birds in the pine trees that covered the mountainside sloping high above the 3-story house, and the soft splash of water flowing from the lava rock waterfall into the fish pond. A cool breeze feathered across her cheeks. The last remnants of her earlier tension eased with its caress, and she relaxed. It was no surprise to Maggie that so many of her tenants over the years had found solace and refuge in this place during their times of trouble or change. The house seemed to have a vibration that drew those with wounds to heal or transformations to make, and Maggie did her best to be a presence that nurtured and supported those who came through her home as they found their peace. She believed in the interconnectedness of life, that what you give to another, you give to yourself. She felt it everywhere, every time she offered a smile, every time she cooked a meal, every time she shared a moment. Caring for others brought her peace. She opened her eyes and took in the hot pinks and purples of the bougainvillea that lined the back wall. She smiled. Perhaps Eve Jacobs's peace could be found here as well.
You've been listening to Chapter 1 of Threads of the Heart by Jeannie Levig and narrated by Jamie Patterson.
This was an episode of Book Clips. Check out the show notes for more on this book. And it would be great if you would rate the show and subscribe to the Lesbian Talk Show podcast channel for more woman-centered content. If you are an author of lesbian fiction, then send us your reading. You can find out how on thelesbiantalkshow.com/reading.